During the Vietnam War, 766 Americans were confirmed prisoners of war. Of them, 114 are known to have died in captivity, but the actual number is higher because many of those listed as missing in action probably died after capture. Some were severely wounded in combat and only survived a few days after capture, while others were shot attempting to escape. The Hanoi Hilton is the nickname given by American POWs to the Wo Lo prison in Hanoi, Vietnam. It was built as a French colonial prison in the late 1800s. In 1913, it was renovated to hold 600 prisoners, though overcrowding swelled the number to 2,000 by 1954. The prison and its poor conditions were a focal point of hatred and resentment of French rule among the Vietnamese. Locals dubbed it Ho Lo, translated as fiery furnace or hellhole. After the French were expelled, the Vietnamese took over and treated prisoners just like the French treated theirs, so American POWs suffered. The status of American POWs was never clear. Vietnam never attacked the United States or its ships, and the United States never declared war on Vietnam. One day, American warplanes began bombing Vietnam, and the Vietnamese declared these criminal attacks. When American pilots were shot down, many were killed by vengeful farmers and were lucky not to be executed by the Vietnamese government since they had no legal status as a prisoner of war. They were kept alive to collect military information and as political bargaining chips. Not all POWs were pilots. On April 6, 1967, 20-year-old Douglas Hegdahl was knocked overboard by the blast of a 5-inch gun while an American cruiser 3 miles off the coast of North Vietnam. No one saw him fall. He swam until picked up several hours later, and Vietnamese militiamen clubbed him repeatedly with their rifles, thinking he was a commando. He was released early by the Vietnamese in 1969 as a political gesture. This is film of other POWs being released in 1973. Several soldiers and Marines had been captured during ground battles. During the 9th of January 9, 1968, 2 companies from the Army's 169th Infantry Brigade were overrun and 8 soldiers taken prisoner. Most were wounded and 2 died soon after. 6 soldiers survived captivity and were released years later. On November 8, 1967, Private Earl Weatherman escaped from a Marine Corps brig. He had been convicted of several minor offenses and was sentenced to 5 months' confinement and a bad conduct discharge. After his escape, while en route to see a girlfriend in the village near Chu Lai, he was captured by the enemy. He subsequently defected to the Viet Cong and assisted in their propaganda effort by making propaganda broadcasts and signing a propaganda leaflet. The Marine Corps listed him as a deserter in the hands of the enemy. In February 1969, only a few weeks after arriving in Vietnam, Sergeant John Sweeney disappeared from Company M, 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines. Unable to keep up with his company, he was left behind and told to join the rear guard that was only minutes behind. When the rear guard arrived, Sweeney was nowhere to be found. During the search, Marines found Sweeney's gun and ammunition, but nothing else. It would be 9 months before anything more was heard of Sweeney. North Vietnamese radio broadcast by Sweeney referred to himself as a deserter and spoke of joining the Vietnamese cause. Here is part of a 1970 broadcast.
Next, we have a taped message from an American prisoner of war to United States troops in Vietnam.
I am John M. Sweeney, Private First Class, United States Marine Corps. On February 22nd, I crossed over to the side of the Vietnamese. An open letter to American GIs. Some of you people over here in the Nam think you're fighting for freedom and justice and democracy. You have to be kidding yourselves. I think most of you realize by this time that you are not fighting in Vietnam to defend the United States. Most of you know that you're being used as hired killers for the Saigon bandits. Let's face it, the only reason that the 3 Saigon stooges have stayed in power is because 40,000 GIs have died to keep them there. And the way it looks now, Tricky Dick is going to let 40,000 more GIs die over here.
In August 1970, Sweeney was flown to Sweden, with a North Vietnamese passport and released. On his return to the United States, he was charged with desertion and aiding the enemy. Sweeney admitted to participating in broadcasts, but said he did so under duress. Sweeney was found not guilty of all charges and honorably discharged from the Marine Corps. After all POWs had returned home in 1973, 8 enlisted men were charged with mutiny, making propaganda statements, cooperating with the enemy, disobedience of orders, and attempting to persuade other POWs to disobey orders. They were accused by Air Force Colonel Theodore Guy, who was a senior officer in their POW camp at a place called Plantation Gardens. 2 commissioned officers, Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Edison Miller and Navy Captain Walter Gene Wilbur, were charged with mutiny, failure to obey orders by accepting special favors from the enemy, making propaganda statements, informing on fellow prisoners, attempting to persuade others to disobey orders, wrongfully communicating the activities of fellow prisoners to the enemy, and attempting to promote mutiny, disloyalty, and insubordination among fellow POWs. On June 27, 1973, one of the accused enlisted men, Marine Sergeant Abel Cannavaugh, who had spent 5 years as a POW, shot himself with a pistol and died. Charges against the others were dropped. 6 years after the world was told all American POWs had been released, Marine Corps Private First Class Robert Garwood appeared. Captured by the Viet Cong in 1965, Garwood had spent 14 years in North Vietnam until released in 1979. Garwood was not a regular prisoner of war. After a few years, he learned to speak Vietnamese, fully cooperated with his captors, and was integrated into Vietnamese society. The U.S. government asserted that Garwood chose to remain behind when all POWs were released in 1973, but Garwood claimed they kept him since he was an expert auto mechanic. In 1979, he slipped a note to a Finnish diplomat in Vietnam, and when the story broke in the press, the Vietnamese quickly released him to Thailand. Garwood was put on trial for collaborating with the enemy. At his 1980 court-martial, Marine prosecutors accused him of desertion, encouraging other American soldiers to defect, maltreatment of fellow POWs, wearing the enemy's uniform, and carrying enemy weapons. The Marine Corps eventually dropped the charge of desertion since there was no proof and Garwood only had 10 days left on his 1-year Vietnam tour and was clearly looking forward to going home to Indiana. He was a headquarters jeep driver who got lost and was captured at gunpoint, but was still charged with unauthorized absence from his unit. Some think officers attempted to evade blame for Garwood's capture since he was driving through a dangerous area alone. Garwood was convicted of helping the enemy, reduced in rank, and stripped of $148,000 in back pay that had accumulated during his 14 years in captivity. Garwood said other POWs remained in Vietnam and says he was prosecuted to cover up this embarrassing information. If he had voluntarily remained in Vietnam as the U.S. government claimed, why did he have to slip a note to a diplomat to gain attention for release? John McCain spent 5.5 years as a POW after being shot down on a bombing mission. He became America's most famous POW and a powerful U.S. senator who ran for president. This was possible after he married Cindy Lou Hensley, pictured, who was 18 years younger and worth millions of dollars from her father's Arizona beer distributorship. McCain ran for Congress shortly after this marriage. He had just dumped his previous wife. During her husband's captivity, Carol McCain raised their children, sent frequent letters and packages to him in Vietnam, and became active in the POW MIA movement. In 1969, she was severely injured in an automobile accident. Carol and John were reunited upon his release in 1973. She was now 4 inches shorter, in a wheelchair or on crutches, and substantially heavier than when he had last seen her. John McCain began dating other women and found someone else. His children refused to attend his second wedding. Ronald and Nancy Reagan were longtime friends of the McCains and angry. They helped Carol find a place to live and a job. John McCain spent most of his political career advocating for American military intervention everywhere. The United States and Vietnam established formal diplomatic relations in 1995. The first U.S. ambassador to Vietnam was Pete Peterson, a U.S. Air Force pilot who had spent over 6 years as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam after his plane was shot down. On September 10, 1997, he visited the village where he had been taken prisoner and drank tea with the 2 men who had captured him. He said, quote, "I returned here not to relive what was probably the most unhappy day of my life, but to signify to the entire world that reconciliation is not only possible, but absolutely the way to reach out."